A little girl was murdered inside her own home on a quiet street in one of the safest towns in America, and 30 years later, nobody has ever been arrested. Not because the evidence doesn't exist. It does. It's been sitting in a lab since the 1990s. The real story here isn't a whodunit. It's how a police department, a prosecutor's office, and a broken chain of decisions let a killer walk free while the world argued about theories on television instead. On December 26, 1996, in Boulder, Colorado, 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey was found dead in the basement of her family's home, hours after her mother called 911 to report her missing. What followed became one of the most obsessively covered crime stories in American history: tabloid front pages, made-for-TV movies, true crime podcasts, documentaries, and enough amateur theorizing to fill a library. And yet, despite all of that attention, despite DNA evidence recovered from the child's own clothing, despite a grand jury that actually voted to indict people back in 1999, nobody has ever been formally charged with her murder. That gap, between how much the public thinks it knows and how little has actually been resolved, is the real subject of this video. Boulder in 1996 wasn't built for a case like this. It was a university town, tucked against the foothills of the Rockies, the kind of place with almost no homicides in a typical year. The Ramsey family fit right into that picture of quiet prosperity. John Ramsey ran a billion-dollar computer distribution company. His wife, Patsy, was a former Miss West Virginia, who had survived ovarian cancer a few years earlier and poured her energy into her 2 children, especially into elaborate Christmas traditions, and the children's pageant circuit that JonBenet competed in. Their home was a 15-room house with multiple staircases and a rambling basement, exactly the kind of layout that would later make the crime scene a nightmare to process. The family had spent Christmas evening at a friend's house and came home around 9 at night. JonBenet had fallen asleep in the car and was carried up to bed. At some point during the night, in a window investigators would later place between roughly 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., she was killed inside that house. There was no broken window, no forced door, nothing a neighbor heard. In a home with 4 people under one roof, in one of the quietest towns in the state, a child died and the house stayed silent. The next morning, Patsy Ramsey found something on the back staircase. A handwritten note, nearly 3 pages long, addressing her husband directly and claiming their daughter was being held by a small group demanding a specific ransom. It read less like something scrawled in a hurry by a kidnapper and more like something composed at leisure, full of dramatic phrasing, oddly literary, patient. Investigators would later determine the notepad and the pen used to write it both came from inside the house itself. Whoever wrote it hadn't brought anything with them. They sat down somewhere in that home, in the dark hours of that night, and took what forensic experts estimated could have been 20 minutes to nearly an hour to produce it, while a child lay dead or dying nearby. The ransom demand itself was strange too, a specific figure that, when investigators checked, lined up almost exactly with a bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company. That's not the kind of detail a random intruder would know. It's the kind of detail that lives inside a family's private conversations about money. None of that, on its own, proves who did it. But it did something else just as important. It destroyed the 2 things every homicide investigation depends on: an undisturbed crime scene and an untouched body, before investigators even had a chance to process either one. Because of the ransom note, the case was initially treated as a kidnapping in progress, not a murder. That single framing shaped everything that followed. Officers waited for a ransom call that the note promised would come between 8 and 10 that morning. Friends, a minister, and victim advocates were let into the house to support the family while that call was expected. People made coffee, sat on furniture, used the bathrooms, opened the refrigerator, every normal, human thing you'd do to comfort a grieving family, and every one of those things added fibers, fingerprints, and footprints to a scene that hadn't yet been identified as a homicide scene at all. Boulder's police department, more accustomed to property crime than anything like this, had a single detective managing the house for critical early hours. By early afternoon, the ransom call still hadn't come, and the story the note told was starting to fall apart. In that limbo, with an overwhelmed detective trying to manage a shrinking pool of options, Jon Ramsey and a family friend were asked to search the house for anything unusual. It's an instruction that would be second-guessed for decades afterward, because it meant the father of a missing child, someone who, statistically, could not yet be ruled out, was moving through his own home unsupervised. At the exact moment the most important physical evidence in the case was still sitting somewhere inside those walls. Jon Ramsey found his daughter's body in a small windowless room in the basement, wrapped in a blanket, wrists bound above her head. What he did next is completely understandable, as a father, and completely devastating, as a piece of evidence handling. He didn't step back and call for the scene to be preserved. He pulled the tape from her mouth, undid the bindings, picked her up, and carried her upstairs. In doing that, he altered the position of the body, transferred trace evidence in both directions, and eliminated forever the one thing no photograph or reconstruction could ever recover: the exact scene as the killer had left it. So by the end of that first day, before investigators had even fully processed what they were looking at, the two foundations any homicide case is built on were already gone. Not because a killer cleaned up after themselves, but because a house full of frightened, grieving, well-meaning people had unknowingly walked through the story before anyone could read it. What the autopsy eventually revealed only deepened the puzzle. JonBenet had died from strangulation, with a significant skull fracture also present, a blow serious enough that a forensic pathologist later testified it would have rendered her instantly unconscious. Around her neck was a cord, tied to a broken paintbrush handle taken from an art supply kit in the basement, twisted into a garrote. The order in which those two injuries occurred became one of the most argued over questions in the case, because it changes the entire picture of what kind of person did this: someone whose violence spiraled out of an initial accident and panic, or someone who came prepared to do exactly this. For years, circumstantial details pulled investigators back toward the people inside that house: the note written on the family's own paper, the paintbrush from the family's own supplies, the ransom figure that matched a real bonus almost to the dollar. One Boulder detective became so convinced the truth was inside the family that he resigned from the case in protest and later published a book laying out that theory. Then the lab results came back, and they didn't fit that theory at all. In JonBenet's underwear, mixed with her own blood, was DNA from an unidentified male. Later testing found what appeared to be the same male profile on the waistband of her clothing, at two separate points. That profile didn't match Jon Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, her brother, or anyone else tested from inside the family's circle. To some investigators, that was the clearest physical evidence in the entire case: a genetic signature belonging to someone outside the household. To others, it was potential contamination, a stray trace introduced somewhere along the manufacturing or handling of the garment before it was ever worn. That single disagreement has shaped almost 3 decades of debate. In 2006, a man named John Mark Carr confessed to the killing from Thailand, describing details that briefly convinced much of the public the case had finally broken open. His DNA didn't match, and it became clear his account had been built from years of obsessively reading about the case rather than from first-hand knowledge. He was cleared within days. It was a reminder of how the DNA evidence has functioned in this case for most of its history, as a filter that can rule people out, but one that was never fully pushed to try to rule someone in. That distinction matters because the tool to do exactly that already exists. Forensic genetic genealogy, uploading a crime scene DNA profile to genealogy databases, and building a family tree back toward a living relative, is the technique that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018, and has since helped close hundreds of other cold cases across the country. For years, that same approach was not applied to the profile sitting in the Ramsey case, with officials citing sample degradation, chain of custody concerns, and the need to coordinate across jurisdictions, and with the FBI. There's also a piece of this story that stayed hidden from the public for over a decade. In 1999, a Boulder grand jury reviewed the evidence in secret, and the district attorney publicly announced there wasn't enough to bring charges against anyone. It wasn't until 2013, after a journalist sued to unseal the record, that the public learned the grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not for murder, but for child abuse resulting in death and for acting as accessories after the fact. The sitting district attorney chose not to sign that indictment and never gave a full public explanation. For 14 years, people believed no one had been willing to point a finger at anyone. In reality, a jury had pointed one, and a single official had quietly overridden it. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in 2006, still living under public suspicion that DNA evidence had already done a great deal to undercut. In 2008, Boulder's district attorney at the time formally cleared the Ramsey family, including their son, based on the touch DNA findings. That clearance came 2 years after Patsy's death, too late for her to hear it. Where the case stands now is genuinely more active than it's been in years, even if it remains unsolved. Boulder's police department has said publicly, in its most recent annual updates, that detectives have conducted new interviews, followed up on tips, and retested evidence using techniques that didn't exist when the crime occurred. The department's current chief has acknowledged that DNA technology keeps evolving and has framed the case as an ongoing priority rather than a closed door. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, has spent years publicly pushing for the case to be submitted to outside labs capable of running full forensic genetic genealogy on the profile, and independent DNA experts have echoed that same call, arguing the tool that cracked hundreds of other cold cases has still never been fully applied here. Separately, a forensic analyst who once worked within Colorado's state crime lab was found to have mishandled evidence across hundreds of unrelated cases over nearly 2 decades, scandal that, while investigators say there's currently no evidence it touched the Ramsey case specifically, has added yet another layer of scrutiny to how physical evidence has been handled in this state for years. So no, this case has not been solved. Anyone telling you otherwise, this week or any other week, is getting ahead of the facts. What's true instead is something almost stranger than a solved mystery. The evidence to potentially identify a killer may already exist, sitting in storage, and the technology to use it properly has existed for years. What's been missing isn't a clue. It's been coordination, urgency, and the will to actually finish the job. So here's what I want to ask you. If the DNA in this case is finally run through full forensic genetic genealogy, not just checked against a family, but built out into an entire family tree the way it was done for the Golden State Killer, do you think we'll finally get a name? And if we do you think it'll be a stranger, or someone who was standing in that house the whole time? Tell me what you think in the comments.